Thank you very much. Thanks for coming this morning. And thanks also to Venkat and Lance for doing such a great job of setting out the landscape so far with regard to compliance. Really what I want to do in the next 20 minutes is to see where we can go beyond compliance. And I want to start with a quote from Michelle Denedy, who is currently the CPO for Intel Security. She was formerly the CPO at Sun Microsystems and one of the first execs with that title to really make an impact. So whether or not you agree with what she says, I think she's got the credibility that what she says deserves to be thought about. And one of the things she said was, if you focus on compliance, you will fail. If you focus on people, you'll succeed. And so what I'd like to look at briefly is, how do we do that? With a little bit of why do we do that? Before I do, I should probably give a little bit of background about the Internet Society, because a disturbing number of people that I've talked to here don't know what we do. So that's our mission statement. It looks a bit motherhoody, but there's a strong rationale behind it. One of the things the Internet Society does is it's the parent organization of the IETF. So all those RFCs come from a community that operates under the umbrella of the Internet Society. So we have a huge technical resource at our disposal. What we try and do is translate between those techies and the other stakeholders who shape the landscape of the internet, the policymakers, the network operators, the deployers of DNS, the technology vendors, and of course civil society, because you can't make the internet a productive resource for everyone, to everyone's benefit, if you don't take care of the social and civil society aspects. There's a numbers slide. We are all over the place. We have about 72,000 individual members. We have a tiny staff of about 70 or 80 people who reach out to those chapters and members. And we are a worldwide non-profit. I would describe us as an advocacy organization. Okay, so lots of the speakers this week have had the obligatory, what I think has been referred to as the obligatory IoT numbers slide. This is mine, it just doesn't have any numbers on. But what I wanted to try and do with this is sketch out a little bit of context. Where are we in the technology timeline? So we've kind of gone from the early days of federation, around the turn of the millennium. At that point, we were really thinking about e-everything, weren't we? E-government, e-commerce. The dot-com bubble had just about burst, but we were still thinking about the ways in which everything could be turned into an electronic service. And the federation efforts that many of you were involved with had their origins there. Then I think at the moment, firstly, we're in a kind of social evolution of the internet. The social media aspects of it are important to so many of us and weave their way into all of our lives. But one of the effects of that is that a major economic driver of the internet now is the monetization of personal data. So if you take those two things together, you've got social networking services that reach into the intimate details of our everyday lives. You've got monetization as an extremely powerful economic engine driving innovation and development in the internet. And then you start to look at the impact of the Internet of Things in terms of scale, in terms of the number of devices, in terms of the data that those devices generate about us. So we are currently, I think, in the monetization age, and we're moving towards a period of extremely high volume connectedness. All of those devices generate data and metadata about us, and the volume of that data is about to increase exponentially. Now, if your business model is currently based on the monetization of personal data, I imagine that you're salivating at the prospect of that exponential growth of data. Because really what it does is it beefs up, it turbocharges the engine that currently drives what you're doing. But I think that has some consequences for us as individuals. If you take scale, going up there exponentially, and you take the monetization factor as the thing that's driving this, the impact on that on us as individuals, I think, is profound. It's profound in terms of usability. How do users manage all those devices and what they are saying about us? It's profound in terms of what I call agency, your ability to express your preferences as to what your devices should do on your behalf. And that has an ethical dimension, which is what I want to focus on in the next couple of slides. Now, that may come as an unwelcome surprise for many of you who thought you were coming to a techie conference. But as I think I've indicated, technology reaches into our lives in such detail now that there is no such thing as ethically neutral technology. All of it has an ethical impact on us. So, I don't know, hands up anyone who had to do Ethics 101 at some point in their... Oh, crap. That's quite a lot of... Okay, that means we can go through this fairly fast. So you probably remember that there are three main models of ethics. There's the consequentialist model, or utilitarian, that says that an action is good or bad depending on its outcomes. And if it has bad outcomes, you shouldn't do it, and if it has good outcomes, you should do it, and you should strive for the actions that have the most, that do the most good. Then there's the next one that comes from Immanuel Kant, mainly, the the rules-based one, that says you should do something because the rules say that you should do it. How you define those rules depends on how you've approached that problem, but he had some ideas. And then there's this last one, which I've labeled fairness because it comes from the work of John Rawls in the mid-70s. He called it a theory of justice, but that does sound a bit kind of leotardish, doesn't it? So I thought I'd just make it for normal people. It's fairness. It's about fairness, that when you're choosing between two courses of action, you should choose the one that is fairer. So let's look at a couple of those in a little more detail, because as they stand there, they're great for Ethics 101, but they're not very practical. And what we find out if we look at them in more detail is that a couple of those models really have some quite serious shortcomings. Think about the internet of today with data collection, targeted advertising, and as I say, the monetization of your personal data. How do you actually determine the consequences of what you do in that environment? How do you as a user know which of your actions it was that resulted in that targeted advert showing up in your browser? It's pretty tough. And it's tough because that data goes through quite a complex food chain of monetizers. Well, the participants in that monetization ecosystem are many, and they are mostly invisible to us, the subjects of. Some of the other issues with the consequential model in today's internet are, for example, that the participants in that monetization food chain, they hold the cards, really. You as a consumer don't see them, don't really know what they're doing, can't influence what they're doing, except in theoretical ways like adjusting your buying habits. That's not going to have an effect immediately, is it? So there's a huge amount of dilution that goes. Here we go. We back again? Yeah. There's a lot of dilution that goes on of the effect of you as a moral agent, because the things that you do feed their way through that ecosystem, and the outcomes are very hard to determine. So obviously, it's hard for you to determine what's good and bad in your own interests, but it's also difficult for you to influence what is because of the balance of power, the asymmetry of power between you and the service providers. I won't get into the harm and risk aspects, but any of you who've looked at privacy will probably have seen that there are some problems with defining privacy as something that generates a particular harm. And if the harm isn't economic, it's often very hard to persuade a regulator to do anything about it. Okay? So again, there's dilution there that makes it to turn a consequentialist approach into practical guidelines. So how about the other one, the deontological or rules-based approach? Well, I think that's pretty much what we have at the moment. And you saw Venkat's fantastic slide of here comes the law, and that just massive wall of regulations in what was the font size for that must have been about 4 point, I think, and it covered the whole slide. Yeah. So the wall of regulation. I think that's where we are at the moment, but that too has its drawbacks. It's very bad for cross-border cases, and there's the recent sort of uproar about whether safe harbor provisions are actually working is one example of that. A rules-based approach is also very unreliable if there isn't effective enforcement. And there is not effective enforcement, let's face it. So that leaves us with fairness. What do I mean by that? Well, the first distinction I think to draw here is that fairness implies legitimacy, and legitimacy is not the same as legality. We can all think of behavior that is legal, but is really not legitimate and is not good practice and is actually in some cases distinctly unfair. So when you're trying to determine what behavior is legitimate or not, one principle is to say that there should be no surprises for the end user. When someone finds out what you're doing with their data, they should not have that creepiness reaction. I know some people don't think we should be calling it creepy because that kind of trivializes it. But they should not have that visceral reaction that says, I was not expecting that and I'm not happy to find out. Now, when I say no surprises, I don't mean it's okay for the NSA or GCHQ to do this because it won't surprise the users unpleasantly because we won't tell them. That's cheating. You have to assume that the users will find out, and that if they did find out, they still would not find it to be an unpleasant surprise. So no surprises should not mean you weren't surprised because we didn't tell you. Transparency, I think, in that sense, should also mean that what you're doing should, in principle, be open to scrutiny by third parties. And I've given an example here of a project that we're doing at the Internet Society called Tossback2. We've written an engine that retrieves and parses terms of service, and it analyzes them for changes over time. So we've built up quite an archive of historical changes to service providers' terms of service. We've done a certain amount of analysis of that data, but what we'd really like is to put it as a resource for you folks to write a, in English terms, Rotten Tomatoes website. So a tool that looks at the raw data and says, you know what, actually, over time, this organization's policies have changed in ways that disfavor the user. And this organization seems to be doing good practice because their policies, their terms of service seem to be getting better. So that's a resource that we'd like to put out there. And if you're interested in hearing more of that, come and find me afterwards. And then the third criterion for fairness, I think, is accountability. And that means a focus on should we do this rather than can we do it. Let's face it, the direction of travel, technically, is that it is far easier to collect data than it is not to collect it. It's far easier to aggregate it than to segregate it. It's much easier to keep data indefinitely than to delete it, especially selectively. Hands up anyone in the room who has an empty email inbox. Okay, it's pretty tough. You know, once you're over 17,000 or so emails in there, it's pretty tough to start deleting them selectively. And you always have that kind of pack rat mentality that thinks, yeah, if I delete things non-selectively, I'm bound to delete something that I might want in 5 years' time. At least I do, but then that's why I have 40 T-shirts in my closet, and I'm not very popular for that. So we should be looking at how do we buck the trend of the technical direction of travel. Yes, we can do pretty much anything, but we should be asking the question, should we do this? And accountability also means effective redress in case of failure. If something goes wrong with your personal data, what can you do about it? Is that toothpaste definitively out of the tube, and you don't even have a little shovel to put it back in again? Or can you actually do something practical? So accountability here, again, it's not an easy problem to fix, but I think if we don't have accountability, it makes life far harder for users, and it makes it harder for service providers to demonstrate fairness. So let's have a look at some of the practical implications of that, and I'd like to do so by looking at the ways in which the Internet of Things changes our world. Under these three headings, consent, autonomy, and agency. And by agency, I mean whatever it is that puts a user's intentions and preferences into practice. Because my hypothesis is that the Internet of Things erodes our agency. It erodes our ability to express and enforce our preferences and our intentions. So let's think about some cases where the Internet of Things does funny things to consent. Now, one of the speakers on day one, I think just name's blanking on the name here, but said that in his view, perfect authentication was authentication where the user didn't have to do anything. It was the guy who has the wristband that monitors your heart rate, and it uses that biometric to authenticate you. Okay, so you don't actually have to do anything, you just have to wear the wristband. Well, okay, I don't like what that does to consent, frankly, because it might mean that I have authenticated just by walking past this laptop. And I want there to be something explicit and conscious that I do that I'm aware of that authenticates me. If I'm authenticating without knowing that I've authenticated, then I think my consent is undermined. Anyone who's seen Eve Mailer's demo of the heart application will have seen a little bit about implants and some of the issues they raise. Clearly, an implant, the built-in defibrillator that Eve mentions in her talk, does not have an end-user interface, at least not one aimed at the person who has it inside them. So you do not want people tweaking their own heart rate. So it has user interfaces, but not for the person who's wearing it. And again, that has implications for consent. And then pre-diagnosis. And I had a very touching conversation with someone earlier in the conference about a parent who is just starting to show early signs of Alzheimer's. Now, technically, there may be things that we can do about that. You might, for example, have a wristband that monitors your activity and that flags to someone when your activity suggests that you might be having an episode. Someone who lived in the same street as me, when he was in fairly advanced dementia, his wife found him climbing out the kitchen window at 2 a.m. And to him, at that point, that was what he needed to do. It was perfectly rational. But of course, there were other aspects to it. Now, in that case, his wife was the first person to find out that something was not going right at 2 a.m. that day. But in future, we can quite easily conceive of how the first entity to find out that something is not going right may be the device manufacturer or the health insurer. Yeah? So what happens to consent then? And how do we delegate their authority to tell someone else that something is wrong with their nearest and dearest? Then let's think about autonomy. What degrees of autonomy do we have currently, and how do those change in this hyperconnected world of things? And the simplest example I can think of is driverless vehicles. I don't think we're going to find out all about the ethics of driverless vehicles until someone first gets run over by one. And then we'll find out, as I think Steve Wilson said, what is in the small print of the EULA that you signed when you took the car keys? Yeah? Because I find it hard to believe that under those circumstances, the person who happened to be sitting in the car is going to be held liable for the running over the pedestrian on the pavement. But where is that liability going to stick? Is the manufacturer going to do it? Is it going to be the guy who coded the algorithm? Think about what those algorithms do too. At some point, a car is going to have to decide whether, confronted by an inevitable collision, whether it's going to run you, the one-person occupant, into a vehicle that has 4 people in it, or into 4 people standing on the pavement, sidewalk. Well, it's probably going to do the thing that damages the one person rather than the 4 people. Okay, it's going to swerve into a wall or something. But as the owner and driver of that car, that may not be what you intended. Yeah? That you get deprioritized because there's only one of you, when the alternative was to hit 4 people who don't figure in the EULA. So I think there are some real problems about the ethical effects of autonomous systems. And those also feed into that third point, which is about agency. Now, I mentioned user agents just in a very abstract way, because we've all noticed, I think, that like Pigpen in the Peanuts cartoons, we are now surrounded by a little cloud of data emitted by all the devices that we have and wear. And so there's a scalability issue there, because it becomes increasingly difficult for us to manage all the privacy settings on all the things that are beaconing stuff about us. That's going to be aggravated by the fact that there are still going to be walled gardens and proprietary systems for, automated thermostats are not going to have the same APIs and protocols as automated light bulbs and automated fitness gear and in smart socks. So scalability becomes more and more of an issue as we're surrounded by things that impact our privacy, but over which, for reasons of volume, we have less and less control. So I think the role of user agents of some kind is going to grow in importance. And then finally, coming back to that exponential increase in data that can be monetized and the effect of that as an economic engine driving service providers' behavior, how do we insert better user agency into current business models? Because that economic engine is going to be an extremely powerful one. And the people who profit from it, the organizations who profit from it, are extremely strongly motivated to maintain the status quo. It doesn't really help them if users start to tweak this stuff and regain agency and regain control. So how do we insert better user agency into current business models? So to recap at this point, the Internet of Things already gives rise to models that undermine human agency. Non-human agents and autonomous systems, like driverless cars, are in no way ethically neutral. So we have to address the ethical issues here. And also, this business of devices, the cloud of data that surrounds us, pigpen-like, makes it increasingly hard for us as individuals to maintain separation of different personas. You try having a work phone and a non-work phone, and then just do the little experiment of can you always ensure that both phones are not telling someone that that they're in the same cell at the same time. If you want to make those two devices non-linkable by a third party who can see cell phone location, it's a really tough problem. It's a pain in the neck, frankly, and it reduces the utility of those devices as phones. It's an interesting experiment to do, but it's not very reassuring. So one other way of thinking about this, I think, is that all this data and metadata about us that is generated by these devices may be low trust, it may be small in size, but as it grows in volume, it creates a kind of gravity well of identifiability from which it is impossible for the end user to escape. So the escape velocity from the Internet of Things is infinite. You can't not be identified. But it's not all bad news. I think the fact that we are now so used to operating in mediated, distributed modes of processing, that there are so many links and partners in any given online interaction, actually opens up links where we can insert things like user agents. And there are niches where things that express the user's preferences and intents can fit into that ecosystem. I also think that if we design them well, this idea of abstract user agents, whether it's something on your phone or whether it's a third-party service that offers value add to you, that they're a potential answer to scalability because they give you one place where you can go and look at a dashboard for all your home automation devices. Okay? Again, I'm talking in principle. The challenge will be to get this into a sort of market form. And I think that will also help with what I've called consent fatigue. If you have to go around setting the privacy permissions on 50 light bulbs in your house, how many times are you going to be bothered to do that? But if you've got a dashboard where you can go and do it once, and then the user agent expresses your preferences and enforces them, then I think consent becomes more manageable. These will be in the slides, so I won't go through those, but suffice to say, there are half a dozen or more activities that my team is involved in this area. And again, come and have a chat to me about any of those that catch your eye. But here's the bottom line. This is my call to action. I think if we want to step beyond compliance as a tool that is good but not good enough, we need some practical guidance on how to make those ethical decisions. If you're a data controller and you're wondering whether to do this with a certain pot of data or not to do it, how do you actually make those decisions? What questions should you be asking that will identify you as a good actor in this system rather than a bad one? And in some senses, I think we already are quite good at identifying what makes someone a bad actor. But really what I think I want here is to set out some criteria that help you understand what makes a good actor. And I would really like some help with that. So I think we should be exploiting the fact that the internet encourages decoupled architectures to get user agency in there, things acting on the user's behalf. We're all walking around with very powerful computers, many of them. We should be putting those to work on our behalf. We've got that device intelligence in our pockets and on our persons. We should be using it. But as I say, I think the challenge is twofold. First, to get that into a commercial ecosystem that is very powerful and that is driven by other motivations. And second, to draft practical guidance that helps people put this into reality. So I'd like to finish with one more quote from Michel Denedy, who said that if you treat people with respect, they will reward you with their trust. And that, I think, is a much more sustainable way forward than just to look at personal data as the new oil, something to be mined and exploited. So treat your users with respect and earn their trust. Thank you.